reality and practicalities of reshoring. I'm joined by Omer Abdullah, founder and managing director of the Smart Cube. Hello, Omer. How are you?
Hi, Bob. I'm doing well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate it. So, what are some of the major issues today that companies face in reshoring manufacturing to the US?
Sure. So there's a host of issues, and I would look at them from a couple of different perspectives. I look at them from both an internal point of view, an organizational point of view, as well as a external market perspective as well. From an internal perspective, there's the obvious ones, which is, companies have spent a lot of time and a lot of money thinking through these global, complex, interconnected supply chains that they built up over the years, over the decades. And undoing that and rethinking that in an extreme sense, if we're to talk about pure reshoring of all of that work back to the US, that's a pretty monumental task, if it's even at all possible in a complete sense. So that restructuring of the supply chain is a major challenge that you have to think through all of the different piece parts, from sourcing right the way through to manufacturing, right the way through to the distribution aspects. Mm-hmm. Of course, a lot of this distills down to aspects around production costs, which of course leads to labor cost considerations. The US is a higher price market than, say, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and countries in Southeast Asia. So certainly production and labor costs have to get considered, but also aspects around access to the right kinds of labor, right? In terms of what kind of work people want to do. We're all hearing about the manufacturing skills gap that's at play right now. So are you even able to get that? So I think those are a few illustrative examples, but those are the internal considerations. Beyond that, there are the external factors as well. If you consider a company like, let's pick the most obvious example, Apple, right? Global player, plays in pretty much every country in the world. For them to say, we're going to move all of our manufacturing back from China over back to the US has a lot of implications. First and foremost, the internal aspects that I just talked about, but also political may not be the right word, but certainly broader considerations about their market presence in China, as an example. I'm just picking China as one example there, but how does that reflect on your presence in the space? If you look at China as a potential consumer market, which it is, and it's only growing, how do you consider what those implications are from a political perspective in the region as well? So there's a host of factors that play into this whole reshoring topic that I think add a lot of complexity and nuance to that consideration.
That is a lot of factors. And in the case of Apple, of course, they have an extremely complex supply chain. It's not just they make everything in China and ship it here. They source stuff from all different countries, right? And you also, interesting, you mentioned about the need to bring along your suppliers. We talk about these supplier campuses sometimes that surround manufacturing plants. So that whole thing would have to come over. So you talked about some of the natural restrictions, the inherent restrictions that they face. What about regulations and things like that, compliance? What are some of the areas that they have to think about when reshoring comes into the picture?
Yeah. So, there's a host of factors around the restrictions and regulations that are faced. I mean, there's certainly foreign country exit rules that you would have to think about and consider. There is the aspect of how do you shut down facilities, and are you even able to do that? Some organizations, when they go into manufacturing in non-US and let's say Asian locations, et cetera, have to deal with this issue of offsets. Well, now how do you deal with that, and how do you sort of manage around some of those aspects? So those sorts of requirements, from a taxation perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from some of the nuances of the companies that you deal with. All of those factors play in and really impact how you need to think about this. Now, from a compliance perspective, there's a compliance aspect of the country you're leaving and the rules that you have to observe and abide by there. Then there's the aspect of how you make the right decisions in terms of when you're coming over back to the US in this case, since we're talking about reshoring, aspects of, do you understand the market and the availability of the capabilities and skills that you need? Do you understand some of the geographic aspects and labor variances that exist? Do you understand some of the risk factors that play in? Demand and supply side considerations, again, in terms of where are you feeding the product that's being produced? Is it coming back? Is it staying here? In which case logistics are somewhat easier. Is it going to go back out across the world? All of those aspects. All of those factors need to be considered. So how can you as an organization, and then as an organization, do you have the capability to be able to really make it work? So those are some fundamental aspects that really throw a wrench into the simplicity of the idea of simply reshoring back.
Yeah. And when it comes to making the decision as to where you're sourcing generally, on the one hand, you have the risk of concentrating your supplier in one place. On the other hand, you have the cost and complexity of diversifying sourcing, and yet that mitigates the risk of losing that single source. So I'm interested in just how you balance those considerations and how you make those decisions.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, it's an age-old conundrum, right? I mean, it is, on the one hand, you want close supplier partnerships. You want fewer suppliers that you work with because you can have better partnerships. You can share data more openly. You can have better timings from a whether it's a just-in-time system or however you want to set up your manufacturing to be able to really partner closely. And in many situations, take like say in the pharma industry, or other aspects, where you license technologies and you utilize their capabilities, there can be gain sharing arrangements that are put in place. It certainly happens in the CPG space as well. Mm-hmm. So the beauty of supplier concentration is it allows for a much better partnership. But of course, the problem then becomes, now I'm dependent, right? So that's the flip side, where if there's a problem and there's an issue, so for example, everything that happened last year, or pick a crisis that's taken place and how that's disrupted a particular geography and impacted your ability to then move goods from that geography, that supplier dependence has a price that you end up paying. So, then you think about, okay, well, I need to diversify my supply base. Well, how straightforward and easy is that to do? If you're buying a commodity product, it's not really a problem because you've got plenty of folks and you can, pick up and go from one to the other. But if you're sourcing, let's say, APIs in the pharmaceutical space or other complex engineered parts that you're partnering with organizations for, there's a switching cost involved. You don't just find a new supplier, even one who's capable, and pick up tomorrow. There's a 6, 12, 18, 24-month time frame to get them ready, to get them certified, have them at a point where they can really fit in and tool right in to your production process. So it's a tricky aspect, right? And then if you diversify too much, you don't have the right leverage from a pricing point of view, from a capability point of view. So all of those factors have to get really thought through and carefully. It's a balance at the end of the day in terms of how it plays out.
How does the Biden administration's Buy American initiative factor into this? Has it become a big consideration in making this decision, or is it not that major, something that companies should be thinking about?
I think companies need to take it reasonably seriously and consider it. I mean, if you look at there's a couple of things that are quite interesting about it, right? So one is obviously the threshold of made in America going from 55% to 65% to 75% over the next, 7 or 8 years as being the target. There's the aspect of that you now have to disclose the details. You can't just say, yeah, I meet the threshold. It's, you have to provide more of the detail as to what extent you're doing that. There's the factor of $600 billion of federal spending that now has that weight and power. And they buy a lot of consumer goods. They don't just buy aerospace and defense. They buy a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. So companies, I think, need to begin to take that seriously in terms of how that's going to factor in. And I think they have to think hard and fast, hard, certainly, and as this evolves. Now, we don't know all of the details of the policy, right? So, for example, they talk about price preferences that are being given. So if I'm an organization and I'm thinking, there's an incentive for me to reshore back here, well, what's the magnitude of that incentive that I get? My labor cost, let's say, for example, my production costs will go up. Therefore, the cost of my product is higher. Now, the administration is saying as part of the Buy American program that they'll give price preferences, but we don't really know what that is at this point in time, but hopefully we'll know more as time goes on. But all of those factors have to get considered. So it just points back to the thing of, so to answer your original question, 100%, we have to take it seriously. And I do think there is a broader sense in the US that we need to think about, offshoring shouldn't be a reflex action, right? For many years, there's a lot of companies where it was a reflex action. That's what I'm going to do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The default, but there are trade-offs, and there are trade-offs. I mean, there's many situations where it makes perfect sense, and there's many situations, where it doesn't make sense, where the service aspect you lose out on, or the cost aspect you lose out on. So it's important to consider all of those factors. So I think we have to take it seriously. I think you have to look at and do scenario analysis in terms of what the total cost of ownership implications are, or the should cost the implications for your product if you were to move from that threshold, depending on wherever you are today as an organization, from the 55% to the 65 and 75, et cetera.
Yeah, it's really hard to gauge, Omer, as to what kind of move we're actually seeing, because I talk to some people who say reshoring is definitely happening. And I talk to others who say reshoring is never going to happen to any great degree. So, but you are saying, are you not? The implication here is that there is a possible scenario whereby it does make economic sense if you consider all the factors that we've talked about the last few minutes. Is that correct?
Exactly right. And look, I don't think there's an extreme right or wrong answer in any of this. I mean, it's kind of like the work from home conversation we're having today, where there's a school of thought that says the office is dead, and I'm in downtown Chicago, that all of this is going to go away. And then there's a school of thought that says it's all going to come back. I think the answer, I mean, right now, the answer, I think realistically is somewhere in between, for sure. Mm-hmm. There's certain types of jobs where you'll be remote, and there's other types where you've got to be back in the office. I think the long-term trend personally on the work from home issue is we're coming back for the most part to the office, but that's a separate topic. On this particular issue, I would say, I think, companies have to think hard. They have to think about, as I mentioned, total cost of ownership, but they have to look at the skills that are available. They have to look at the costs that are available. They have to look, actually, a lot of companies are going to get forced to ask some pretty strategic questions, which is, what are you competing on? Are you competing on cost? Or are you competing on value in terms of your product? Now, this is a broader strategic question that we have to think about, right? And so I think those who compete more on value, on operating as a premium, as a specialty player who can charge more, I think they've got more opportunity to reshore. That may well be the right decision. Interestingly enough, that Apple example, Apple is a premium player that plays to a mass market and yet has incredible margins, much like a luxury brand, right? So they've kind of figured out, but Apple's the exception in being able to do that, right? And even Apple, if you ask them if they're going to fully reshore, I'm not speaking for Apple. I've not talked to anybody at Apple.
Yeah.
I would imagine they're going to want to preserve their margins and manage a lot of what's going on. So I don't think it's a black and white answer. I think every organization has to do an analysis from a total cost of ownership. They have to look at skills. They have to look at labor costs. They have to look at market access, logistics, all of those factors, and then make a decision as to where the right location is.
Omer Abdullah of the Smart Cube, thank you so much for sharing with us the subtleties and complexities of the decision involving reshoring of manufacturing back to the United States. Thank you very much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Great being with you.
Thanks.